Thank you, Alison. I should say this is the first outing for some research that's related to my project on masculine identity among non-commissioned medical service personnel in the British Armed Forces. And this is a related bit of research to do with the voluntary medical services, and in particular the Friends Ambulance Unit. This paper is coming up a fraction short on time, so I'm hoping there'll be lots of discussion and lots of comment to give me pointers with where to go with this material. The Friends Ambulance Unit, British Society of Friends, and the Adventure of War. In his autobiography, The Grace of Forgetting, Geoffrey Winthrop Young, one of the founder members of the Friends Ambulance Unit, wrote of a meeting that he had in London in the early days of the First World War. Philip J. Baker came to me to tell me of the conflict between traditional principles and the call of their country, which many young friends, especially at Cambridge, were finding themselves in, and of his intention to form them into a trained ambulance corps for field work. This passage captures much of the ambiguity of the unit as one in which young men opposed to conflict in combat on ideological grounds could, nonetheless, experience the adventure and excitement of the conflict while fulfilling their gendered obligations of duty to the nation. This ambiguity is also captured in Young's description of how the unit came to have its title, once the original title of the Anglo-Belgian Ambulance Unit had become odious. As Young described it, quote, "2 of our officers were Quakers by birth, but 3 were not. But we were all personal friends. So I suggested that we should call ourselves the Friends Ambulance Unit, which should cover the whole case as it stood. My suggestion was adopted." This description is slightly disingenuous. While the unit was never entirely made up of Quaker members, the bulk of its funding in these early days did come through the Society of Friends, and fundraising was led by Sir George Newman. Indeed, the original appeal for volunteers had appeared in the Society's journal, The Friend, on the 21st of August 1914, and the Meeting for Sufferings, the representative body of the Society, was inevitably drawn in by many appeals for guidance, although the scheme was never laid before the meeting in the same way as other proposals for relief committees. The ambiguity of the unit's status in relation to the Society was relatively unproblematic in the early years of the war. However, following the introduction of conscription in 1916, it became extremely problematic indeed, as the unit came to be seen by many in authority as an appropriate space for the deployment of conscientious objectors in military support roles, one with the apparent imprimatur of the largest acknowledged group of objectors on the ground of religious conscience in the country. The result was the politicization of the FAU that, as I hope to demonstrate, was perceived by some Quaker members of the unit as a direct challenge to their status as conscientious objectors to war. The resignation of those such as Corder Catchpool, one of the founder members and later adjutant of the unit, stretched the actual connection with the Society of Friends even thinner. In other words, throughout the First World War, the Friends Ambulance Unit was a site where the religious and gendered identities of the men who served with it came into conflict in a number of ways. While the unit attempted to act as a site where such conflict could be resolved, as I will argue today, this was not ultimately possible. What I propose to do is to look in more detail at the formation of the unit as a space both of masculine adventure and service throughout the war. I will then turn to the pressures exerted on it by the 1916 Military Services Act to examine the challenges that were posed to the men who objected to conflict yet felt called upon to serve in conflict zones. Finally, I will and I do mean very briefly, discuss the work of the overseas branch of the unit in the latter half of the war to explore to what extent conflicts between conscience and duty could or could not be resolved. And throughout the paper, I hope to demonstrate how voluntary medical services in wartime, such as the Friends Unit, were both shaped by cultural understandings of appropriate masculinity and in turn helped to influence understandings of men's roles in wartime. The Anglo-Belgian Ambulance Unit, later the Friends Ambulance Unit, was officially formed on the 26th of October 1914, when Philip Baker, later Philip Noel Baker following his marriage, and Geoffrey Winthrop Young met with Sir Arthur Stanley, the chairman of the Joint War Committee of the British Red Cross Society and the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. That's its official title. They asked his acceptance of the unit under the auspices of the Joint War Committee and his help in providing ambulances and equipment to enable them to set off for Belgium at the earliest possible moment. Both were readily granted, and it was arranged that they should leave for London on October 30th. That description comes from the official history of the unit, which gives the impression this was a smooth transition from the formation of the unit to deployment overseas. The manpower of the unit came from the group recruited by Baker, mainly from fellow Cambridge undergraduates who had been undergoing unofficial training at Jordan's in Buckinghamshire since August 1914. Now, the group had originally intended to provide relief to Serbia, but neither the military authorities nor the British Red Cross had initially been willing to sponsor a group of independent pacifist volunteers to go overseas, however much they might wish to die, if need be, with their contemporaries, but not to fight with them. It was only following the collapse of Belgium, when the lack of preparedness on the part of the Royal Army Medical Corps became fully apparent, that the British Red Cross Society was willing to provide sponsorship and support for the unit. There were immense calls on the Society's funds and support following the retreat. The unit had by this point been officially disbanded. Quote, "Could it be reassembled at once? Its two leaders were certain it could. Messages flew over the country. 40 men and some 8 ambulances were collected and driven rapidly down to the coast. On the second day after my Winthrop Young's return, he'd been working in Flanders as a special reporter. We were already embarked on our way to Dunkirk." So this was a rapid adventure, the rapid marshalling of the troops. What is noticeable of this and all the recollections of the formation of the unit, and indeed its first year and a half of service, was the enthusiasm of its participants. Meyer Tatham and James Miles, in their official history of the unit, described the unit setting out almost in knight-errant fashion to look for work wherever it thought such might be found. This echoes the language of Sir George Newman in the book's introduction, where he talks of a band of English Quaker youths who could not by their religious bonds join the colours, nor by the same bonds could they return to college or calling. So they set forth on a quest of chivalry, a quest which became a conquest, the service of healing and the care of him who shall have borne battle. Newman goes on to explain the reasons for such enthusiasm. I think there were 3 motives. First, they were not content to remain passive with folded hands in the midst of conflict because of their religious views, upbringing, or conscientious objection to war. Secondly, they desired to stand beside their companions and friends who went to fight and share their dangers, their self-renunciation, devotion, and sacrifice. Thirdly, they were impressed with the inadequacy of the means and agencies that existed for dealing with the miseries and desolations of war, particularly in the invaded portions of Belgium. The result he described as a record of the adventure and chivalry of youth, a harvest of splendid achievement. The language is that of a heroism and idealized masculinity that derives from the pleasure culture of war and the cult of reimagined chivalry, as identified by Michael Paris and Mark Girouard respectively, that so saturated British middle and upper class culture in the decades preceding the First World War. It is the language of knights and adventures translated from conquest and conflict into the realm of aid and succor. It allowed middle-class young men whose religious convictions set them against militarism and warfare to lay claim to a share of the ethos of service in wartime, and with it an appropriate wartime masculine identity. Significantly, though, that service and the adventure that might accompany it was always to be for the relief of the suffering individual rather than that of the suffering nation. It was not only Quakers, of course, whose religious convictions conflicted with their desire to engage with an event cast by popular culture as a great adventure. David Randall Mcmaster, the only son of an elder of the Congregationalist Church and an active member of his local YMCA, wrote a long letter to his parents justifying his reasons for joining the territorial branch of the RAMC, in August 1914. Quote, "Now, I probably know more about ambulance work than a good many men in the Field Ambulance Corps territorials, owing to my Red Cross and Scout training. As far as knowledge of first aid goes, I think I am qualified to serve either in the ambulances or the Royal Army Medical Corps." Mcmaster was slightly confused. The territorial RAMC was in fact a branch of the RAMC, so he's distinguishing between the regular army and the territorials isn't quite accurate at this point in time. "If I volunteered for either of these, I should probably be stationed at or near Plymouth. This is the best possible work which I could do in any case. Firstly, if the territorials are ordered to the front, the ambulance is bound to go too. But whereas the other branches would be combatants, the latter branch would be non-combatants." This is underlined in his letter. "There would be little risk that I should work as hard as anybody else, though not to destroy others. I'm quite willing to do my share in the defence of the country, and I'm quite certain I could serve in one of those corps, and possibly as a commissioned officer, as they are giving commissions free to qualified persons." Again, this was a slight misunderstanding on Mcmaster's part. Commissions in the RAMC were only going to those with medical qualifications. "This is no war of aggression, but one for the defence of the country. We share the protection of the country, and we ought to be ready to help in its defence." While the FAU was formed as a voluntary body specifically separate from the militarism of the armed forces, Mcmaster's justification for joining the territorial branch of the RAMC, and thus the military, is based on a similar rationale of service, citing care for the sick and wounded as a necessary role in defence of the nation. Joining the medical services at once fulfilled his duty as a patriot and allowed him to retain his moral conviction against combat. Mcmaster was the only child of a relatively elderly mother who tended to play down the risk of physical danger that he ran throughout the war. His letters cover the entire span from 1914 to 18. Nevertheless, his eagerness to join and later his request for permission to volunteer for overseas service, citing the need for unit cohesion and the fact that all the officers and scoutmasters in the unit had already volunteered, can be seen as a desire for excitement and social approbation that must have caused huge conflict for lower middle class and middle class men like himself, whose religious upbringings conflicted with their social and cultural conditioning to define true men as those who served their country in war. For members of the FAU, the conflict between their desire for adventure and service and the cultural approbation such service would bring, and the principles of Quaker pacifism, was inherent in the formation of the unit. As we've seen, the formation grew out of the desire of a group of young men to engage with what they perceived as both the great adventure of their lifetimes and service to the suffering. This latter motivation had its roots prior to the war in the male Friends Christian Fellowship Union and the female Friends Fellowship of Service, which combined and metamorphosed into the Young Friends group by 1911. All these groups had a missionary tenor aiming to engage young Quakers in their religion through active service for the alleviation of suffering, whether in peace or war. And in fact, there's a much longer tradition of service to the suffering that Quakers trace back to the 17th century. As Margaret Hurst has argued, the ambulance unit can be seen as a direct result of the activities and ideas promoted by the Young Friends group, arising as it did from the desire of many young men to serve in the war zone where their countrymen were in hourly danger. The unit continued to raise funds through its contact within the Society of Friends well beyond the initial call for funds and volunteers in 1914, and it publicised its activities throughout the war through the Society journal The Friend, so there was a very strong connection with the Society. However, the unit was never officially authorised by the meeting of sufferings in the way that other relief schemes run during the war, such as the Emergency Committee for the Assistance of Germans, Austrians, Hungarians and Turks in Distress, and the War Victims Relief Committee, both were. For some Friends, the use of the word Friends in the unit title was viewed as objectionable, although such an objection was hard to sustain since by Quaker custom the title had been allowed for almost a century to bodies which drew their officers and most of their members from the Society. After the war, the unit was to claim that 70% of its enrollment were Quakers, although this was not a constant proportion throughout the conflict and decreased over time. The stance on the part of some Quakers against the unit is unsurprising, considering the level of pacifism declared and sustained during the war years. In 1911, at the Swanwick Conference, John Percy Fletcher and Alfred Barrett Brown had emerged as two of the best known and respected Young Friends, both associated with the Young Friends group, for their motion relating to a railway strike which expressed concern at the use of military force and sympathy with the workers. Their motion was defeated, but when John William Graham at the same conference argued that force would always be necessary in dealing with savages, lunatics, children, and strikers, and when wife and children were threatened, he believed all peace principles would go to the wall, the reaction was vociferous. Speaker after speaker voiced hope that he would hold to his convictions to the uttermost. Both men and women repudiated his suggestion that any should lose his soul by doing the killing for their sakes. Nor did the outbreak of war significantly affect these principles. At the yearly meeting for sufferings of 1915, the first following the outbreak of war, it became clear that the society would remain pacifist, more and more emphatically so as time went on. Yet even as the meeting was declaring its pacifism, some friends were recruiting, and 250 young men who were members of the society had voluntarily enlisted. By the end of the war, 560 out of the 1,666 noted as eligible for military service were in the armed forces. This was not a big community, as you will gather. The position of the meeting was never intended to be or viewed by friends as binding on the conscience of the individual. Rather, each young male Quaker had a personal decision to make. From the first, there was a whole spectrum of choices before him. He might volunteer as a soldier, or join the non-combatant service in the forces, or work in ancillary bodies such as the Red Cross or the YMCA. He might at first remain in his own work, or he might volunteer for one of the non-Quaker relief bodies such as the Belgian or Serbian relief funds. He might apply to the Friends Ambulance Unit, or prepare as conscription grenier for alternative service on the land, in forestry, or in a hospital. All of these types of work were organised in part through the society. He might offer to go to France or Holland, or later to Poland or Russia for the Friends War Victims Relief Committee, or he might stay at home and work for the emergency committee set up for the release of distressed enemy aliens in Britain. He might refuse to acknowledge the authority of the state and prepare for a series of prison sentences, or even, at one stage, the distinct possibility of being shot as a traitor. So these were men who were theoretically prepared to face death. One of those who chose initially to join the ambulance unit was Corder Catchpole. And Catchpole is an interesting case study because his path through the war exemplifies the complexities of the Quaker stance on service in wartime. A school friend of Philip Baker's, Catchpole was one of the earliest recruits to the unit, and early in November 1914 he donned the khaki uniform of the FAU and marched with his comrades through the London streets to Charing Cross, bound for France and chanting the inevitable Tipperary. And I ask you to hold on to that image for a minute. Once arrived at Dunkirk, he wrote in a letter home, they asked immediately for volunteer dressers, hundreds of wounded at the station and no one to attend to them. I am not rated as a dresser, but was mad to go, and went, his emphasis. Got round a doctor somehow. I believe I was almost irresistible just then. Whatever his views on conflict, Catchpole's appetite for adventure and experience was as strong as that of his comrade Geoffrey Winthrop Young, and more conventional volunteers looking to serve in uniform, such as David Randall Mcmaster. For 6 months, Catchpole worked tirelessly as part of the FAU, providing both military and increasingly, as the RIMC became better organised and deployed more men, civilian relief in Belgium and Flanders. According to his biographer, William Hughes, he found tremendous satisfaction in being able to give himself so completely to this work. By midsummer 1915, he had been made adjutant of the unit and found himself dealing largely in office work. By November, he was writing, I'm getting soul sick of the work out here the last 4 months, mending motor cars instead of men. And in December, he complained, I should be more content as a hospital orderly, than doing the work I have had to do. Often I have gone about my work all day with a pathetic longing to find someone to be kind to, gentle and loving with. I had felt the funds of sympathy in me drying up for want of exercise. As an adventure, the war was proving as disillusioning to a man who approached it in a spirit of service to his fellow men as to those who entered into it, like Julian Grenfell, with dreams of glory. At the same time, Catchpole was losing his enthusiasm for the type of work he was doing with the FAU. The status of the unit as a voluntary At the same time that Catchpole was losing his enthusiasm for the type of work he was doing with the FAU, the status of the unit as a voluntary service unit of those opposed to conflict was being called into question by the British government's ever-increasing demands for manpower. Kitchener's call for the first 100,000 was swiftly succeeded by Lord Derby's attestation scheme, and when that failed to provide the necessary manpower, the Military Services Act of 1916 was brought in. Although unique among conscription laws in Europe in that it provided a specific exemption for conscientious objectors, conscription nonetheless posed a very real problem for pacifists of conscience, such as the Quakers. In total war, those civilian and voluntary occupations to which accepted conscientious objectors might be assigned by a military service tribunal could be seen as aiding the war effort, either through the provision of materiel or through the freeing up of the labour of men who were then conscripted into the combatant forces. Both of these facts were problematic for the FAU. As Catchpole wrote of his eventual decision to resign from the unit, by 1916, the medical service had been completely reorganised. Voluntary units were either dispensed with or practically absorbed into the regular armies. The wounded no longer lacked help, and the RAMC was often closed to applicants. Men displaced from the service, taken over by the unit for which I had become adjutant, were often drafted into the firing line and complained bitterly that I and my comrades had sent them there. The primary object of our work was refitting men to take their places again in the trenches. Catchpole chose to become one of the 142 Quaker so-called absolutist conscientious objectors who refused to engage with the war effort in any way, and he was imprisoned for his pains. Indeed, the man who had marched off to war as a volunteer in 1914 in a khaki uniform singing Tipperary was imprisoned in 1917 for refusing to obey a military order as a conscripted soldier to put on a uniform. The damage done to the FAU is not limited, however, to the resignation of Catchpole and his brother George and several other members. The 1916 Act was also the cause of the most definite break between the unit and the Society of Friends. As John Ormond Greenwood has noted, during the passing of the Military Services Act, 4 leaders of the Friends Ambulance Unit had been called into consultation by the War Office and asked to collaborate in arranging work of national importance for members of the Society coming under the Act, so that all Quakers coming before the tribunals to be set up for conscientious objectors would be referred to the Friends Ambulance Unit. By entering into these negotiations and agreeing to such a scheme, the unit were putting themselves in a doubly false position, for they were not an official Quaker body, and they had no authority to represent the Society of Friends, which had repeatedly and emphatically declared that it would accept no special arrangements or privileges for its members. In March 1916, the Friends Service Committee was driven to disown the Friends Ambulance Unit, and a period of intense suspicion and bitterness followed. This was deepened by the equivocal statements of Parliament, by the savage application of the Military Service Act by local tribunals, and by the conduct of the Friends Ambulance Unit itself. It advertised its willingness to help the government and allowed its principal field officers, who by this time were not Quakers, to accept honorary commissions in the army to facilitate their work. It is worth reiterating at this point that the principal officers of the unit had never been exclusively Friends. Winthrop Young wasn't a Friend, for instance. Even if, for the public, a Friends Ambulance Unit was the ambulance unit of the Society of Friends. And despite Ormond Greenwood's assertion of bitterness, on May 19th, 1916, the editor of The Friend wrote, "We are not willing, though differing in methods, to be pitted against each other. We decline to be divided. Some Friends undertake one form of service, and some another, each according to his conscience, that all forms of true service spring from a common source and may be inspired by one and the same spirit. So again, the emphasis on the individual conscience of the member of the unit or otherwise. The work of the unit continued, reinforced by non-absolutist and often non-Quaker conscientious objectors such as D.J. Bolton, whose religion I have yet to precisely pin down, who actively sought service in the FAU as an alternative to either military service or prison. However, after the Second Battle of Ypres, the work of the unit shifted substantially from frontline medical care, now undertaken by military medical units, to work such as the staffing of ambulance trains along the lines of communication. This was particularly monotonous, uncomfortable, and labor-intensive work. If a train derailed, which they quite often did, the entire train had to be unloaded by the male support personnel on board, the orderlies, so that the train could then be lifted back onto the lines. This took hours and had to be done with care for men who were suffering from quite severe wounds very often. As Tappan and Miles noted, the unit would have preferred employment which, if not in essence more useful, would bring its work nearer the actual fighting line. In all sincerity, it may be said the unit never wished to avoid the more acute hardships and dangers of the campaign by taking advantage of its members' exemption from military service. For any unenlisted Red Cross body, and especially perhaps the FAU, the situation was almost inevitable. But though the official point of view was realised, there were many members who felt acutely the meagreness of their share of the sacrifice. Tappan and Miles were the officers in charge of the unit from 1915 onwards, so their expression of a desire for frontline service can be taken as an expression of most of the unit. Such was this persistent desire for adventure and excitement, evident as we had seen from the unit's inception, that Philip Baker, as opposed to working on ambulance trains, decided to take a section of the unit to Italy, where they served on the front line for the duration of the conflict. The Italian medical services were far less well organized than in other theaters. As his actions demonstrate, however much Baker's ideals of Christian service to the suffering may have constrained the manner of his service in wartime, his desire for action and adventure was an equally powerful force in determining the nature of that service, of the service that he did end up carrying out throughout the war. Thus, the history of the FAU points to the number of ways in which voluntary medical aid in wartime and the cultural gendering of men in pre-war British society interacted to provide both conflict and fulfillment for young men of strong pacifist principles. Young middle-class men in Britain in 1914 clearly felt motivated by their cultural milieu to view war as a sphere of potential adventure, even if their religious convictions required them to forswear the hegemonic identity of the combatant soldier. Instead, they utilized the concept of service to the individual sufferer rather than the nation to provide an outlet for these desires that could be countenanced, if not condoned, by both the state and their religious brethren. The realities of total war, however, disrupted the carefully achieved balance of conviction and desire through both increasing demands for manpower, which subverted the voluntary nature of the service offered, and the increasing bureaucratization and industrialization of the war, which robbed it of its sense of adventure. While these challenges certainly affected the experiences and perceptions of combatant servicemen as well, they were particularly problematic for men of the FAU. In the end, working for the unit could not fulfill both the desire for service to the suffering and that for adventure and self-sacrifice, despite the efforts of those such as Baker to seek them out. Instead, the former could be found in the tedium and hard labour of the hospital train, while the latter was, for friends such as Corder Catchpool, found in a prison cell in England. The ideals upon which the unit had been founded may have survived the war, and there's evidence for this in the reformation of the unit during the Second World War, which is an aspect of its history that I haven't looked at. The balance of opposing forces that it represented during the First World War, I would argue, did not. Thank you very much.